Hi, I'm Sarah Blithe. Thanks for tuning in to my research talk about strategic and sports communication research. I'd like to begin with a little professional introduction. I earned my PhD in communication in 2012 and my MA in international business communication. I'm currently an associate professor of communication studies, and I'm the 2021 Community Engaged Teaching Fellow. I'm also an affiliate faculty in the Gender, Race, and Identity program and the Osmond Institute for Global Studies. I've also earned some additional certificates, particularly in the areas of online teaching and course delivery, and also in different programs that help foster inclusivity in the classroom. So a few themes are motivating my research agenda. Certainly I'm interested in people and ideas, and so most of my research is talking with actual people or observing actual people and learning more about their lives. I'm driven by social justice, and I'm hopeful that my research makes a difference and makes someone's life in some context a little bit better. I'm also inspired by ideas of balance, and really I have a motivation to seek balance between work and life, and other aspects that are sometimes can feel like competing identities. I'm motivated by an ethic of reciprocity and fairness, and also action. I take an applied approach, and I'm hopeful that there are actual outcomes that can come from my research, my work. So all of this leads to some overarching questions. So looking at policies, fairness, if things are equitable in terms of practice and policy or rules, is the language appropriate? So how is communication linking through all of these issues? And again, issues of inclusion, is everybody included in this space, in this occupation, in this organization, on this field? And what can we do about the problem? So thinking about research as problem-based and then asking questions that might result in positive change in people's lives. So guiding my research are a couple of important theoretical frameworks. I am heavily influenced by intersectional feminism. So again, I started my journey into academia really looking at gender and organization specifically. And so feminism sort of in its second wave iteration. After conducting some research and studies and learning more about it, of course, I started to adopt a much broader approach to feminism, and now I'm very intersectional. So I do consider things like race and ethnicity, class, as well as gender and sexuality, and then other important aspects like ability, parental status, military status, occupational status, those sorts of additional identities that I look at in terms of how people experience life at work. I also follow communicative constitution of organizations. So assuming that organizations are made up of communication and that the way that we interact with each other at work is what actually makes or constitutes the entire organization. And so I think about things like policies, which a person or a group of people wrote in a way to suit a particular type of worker. That's organizational constitution, right, in a very tangible example. But it's also organizations and organizational life are also constituted through practices, what we all do, rituals, paperwork, manuals, greetings, all sorts of aspects of organizational culture and features of organizational life that are made up of communication. And so I take this approach rather than say psychological approach to organizations. I'm taking the communicative approach and assuming that all organizations and the features within organizational life and organizing are created through communication. So all of this kind of translates into a few scholarly interests. So certainly sports communication, which I'll talk about some specific projects in a couple of minutes. Also organizational learning, policy inequities, critical pedagogy. So how do all of these issues play out in an organizational space? Community engagement, work-life balance, and occupational identities. So while this list might seem disparate in some ways, for me, these are all context or ways in which I'm looking at inequity at work, communication, and how communication can either hinder or help what's happening in these spaces, and how we might then do something about it to have a social justice outcome. So I do approach my research through a qualitative lens. I love methods, and I actually like to use a variety of methods in my work. So I've done all kinds of projects, including ethnographic observations, interviews. I've done some work with visual photography. Archival research sometimes I think is important in order to set the context of a macro discourse. Occasionally textual analysis. Occasionally autoethnography, and sometimes I've even done a little bit of mixed methods. I like to collaborate often, and so when I'm collaborating with my colleagues in either sociology or other fields that tend to be more quantitative based, or even in communication, other quantitative scholars, sometimes I've done some work with surveys and working together to do a mixed methods piece. So today I wanted to talk specifically about the contexts that are most relevant for this position, sports communication and strategic communication. So the way I'm looking at sports communication is really how to strategically improve communication within sports organizations, also about sports and how they inform everyday life, and then in local, national, and international sport policies. So a couple publications that I have right now in sports communication. I'm currently working on a book called Physiological Discipline, Fleshing Out Sex Verification and Genetic Information Policies. It's about 80% finished. One moment. Let me pause that phone. Okay, it's about 80% finished. And it's under review right now with the University of Texas Press. It's been through the early editorial review and is now in the full review with peer reviewers, excuse me. So really what this book is looking at is the sex verification policies of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and other kinds of elite organizations. So each sport has their own guiding organization that determines specific policies for athletes, in their own lane, so to speak. And so this project started out actually as a paper that I wrote in 2015 with a colleague of mine. And we were looking specifically at a discourse tracing. So how did the discourse about sex verification testing evolve over time? And what are the ways in which the IOC was, kind of involved in history and the historic moments that actually then influenced individual athletes? So looking at things like the politics and the very outright racism of the presidents of the IOC in the early days, to how politics and regimes are influencing how this testing rolls out. So, during the Cold War, athletes that were accused of being men in the Olympics tended to be from the Eastern Bloc countries. Currently, most athletes who are accused of being either male or not female, and that distinction has kind of changed over time, tend to be from the global south and countries from the global south. And the way that countries respond to this is quite different. So some countries will rally around their athletes and say, what are you talking about? It doesn't matter if this person has an extra chromosome. This person is biologically woman, biologically female, or not. Other countries will say, okay, yep, we're letting go of this athlete. They'll be stripped of their medals and, living their life out no longer as a supported and celebrated athlete. And so looking at the ways in which this has changed from, nude parades where athletes had to walk in front of people and be judged by their genitalia, to chromosomal testing, to now hormone testing and what they're calling, quote, natural doping in women athletes who tend to have higher levels of testosterone. So the way that science and the discourse around sex verification and what is sex and gender has varied wildly over the decades, and the result has been discipline and discrimination against specific types of women over time. So that's one project. I'm still wrapping up that book right now. And I'm also working currently on a paper. I just recently submitted what is hopefully the final R&R it's called From Sport Shooting to Essential Protection, Protean Identification in Gun Culture, and that is with the journal Culture and Organization. And in this study, I'm looking at, also with my colleague from the University of Nevada, Reno, Jen Lanterman, who's in criminal justice. We've been looking at shooting as a sport and also gun ownership in terms of protection and different, discursive reasons why people are engaged and identifying with gun culture. So we attended a number of gun shows across the country, and then we also observed some private sport shooting events, and did some interviews to find out exactly how are people identifying with the gun culture as kind of a large organized body. And what we found really are that there are so many different subcultures that people are might identify with which people might identify, that there's not this overarching gun culture, we argue, but rather there are multiple subcultures that people identify, disidentify, schizo-identify, and what we're talking about in the paper, our contribution is that we believe they protean identify, which means sometimes they are strongly identified with gun culture, sometimes they might disidentify. For example, after a high-profile shooting, people might be disidentifying from that sport identity. They might then re-identify when there are events or competitions. And so this idea that gun culture is monolithic, we think is inaccurate. And instead, we're looking at the ways that people kind of move through identifications in terms of their organizations and sub-organizations. They move through, and sometimes it's very powerful and strong, and sometimes it might retreat a bit. Okay, so I'm also want to share with you some of my research in strategic communication. And in strategic communication, I'm really thinking about how to strategically design or revise messages and practices in order to achieve particular desired outcomes. And so I, in about 2008, I believe, started a consulting company of my own called Equilibrium Consulting. And in this capacity, I like to work with clients, actual organizations, to do management learning and training development. So some of the kinds of topics that I have, done training publications on are employee outboarding, terminations and layoffs, managing up, delegating, negotiation, business writing. So those actual kind of skill-based, the skill side of organizational communication that can hopefully help managers do their jobs better, help employees enjoy their jobs more, help them, get the jobs they want, and those, get the employees they want. So really thinking about these skilled outcome kinds of messages and thinking about communication as something that we can control. So again, if you think back to what I was mentioning earlier with my influence on the communicative constitution of organizations, this is in play here, that I'm assuming if organizations and organizational life is made up of communication, you can control it. You can change it, or you can strategically design for particular outcomes to occur. So a couple of publications that I have in strategic communication. My first book was called Gender Equity and Work-Life Balance, Glass Handcuffs and Working Men in the US. And this book looks very closely at work-life policies and the practices, particularly of men. So I was assuming that until men are also experiencing work-life balance and engaged in care work outside of the workplace, organizations will never be equitable for women in those places. And care work, or what some might call homework or family, will not be equitable for men, and and their desire to participate in those spaces. And so I'm thinking about what are some of the strategic practices and ways that policies might be rewritten so that work life is balanced. I would use the air quotes, that balance is more possible for all employees at work. And how do we kind of disentangle occupational identities and assumptions about ideal workers and working around the clock and this just excessive work and careerism? How do we detangle those assumptions from practices that are harmful and that were really designed decades ago for a different type of worker? Another project I have published in 2019 is called "I Always Knew I Was a Little Girly: The Gendering of Skills in Management Training." And this project came out actually of a consulting project I did where I was delivering strengths-based training. So Marcus Buckingham and his colleagues have their book, The Strength Finder, in Clifton, Strength Finder. And it's developed into a huge Gallup-funded project where they actually have trainings and employees can do quizzes to find their strengths. And I realized in these trainings that many of the participants were gendering the skills. So the quiz gives you a list of strengths, like these are your best skills that you have, and it assumes that you should try to work to your strengths. So do the things that you're good at. And I found in these trainings that people were gendering the skills. So, as the title indicates, for example, one man that, got the strength of empathy, and he said, well, I always knew I was a little girly. And I heard those kinds of comments over and over in the trainings where people were actually assigning social identities to the skills, which, as far as strategic communication goes, is critically important to think about. How are we positioning our strengths? For our students, how are they positioning their strengths on the job market? How are employees thinking about negotiating? All of this is based on leadership, for example. I mean, how are people thinking about leaders based on skills that they have? And then how are assumptions about social identity cross-cutting what people might want to achieve or might want to do at work? So going forward, I have a lot of ideas. I get excited about research, and I always kind of have an idea cooking somewhere that I'm thinking about. So right now I'm working on a book called The Old Girls Club: Networking and Exclusion in Women's Leadership. And I have the data collected for this one based on 60 interviews with high-level executive women at work. I'm also really interested in maybe pursuing something about elite athlete mothers. I was very struck by the recent events at the Olympics where some Olympians who were mothers were not allowed to go because they couldn't bring their children because of COVID restrictions. And it just got me thinking quite a bit about elite athlete moms. And, because there's so much body work required for that occupation, it is an occupation that I would assume kind of rubs up against traditional standards and thoughts about motherhood. So I'm interested in pursuing something like that. And I'm also interested in looking at youth sport organizations and identities. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have when I see you next week on campus.